I feel compelled to share this crazy and off-the-wall tale as a cautionary warning to those who might underestimate the power of the supernatural and unknown around us. See, this happened not too long ago, and it was extremely terrifying. And this is my horror story. Nestled in the shadow of towering pines in a small town, I rented a cabin for the end of summer until around mid-fall. It was a secluded cabin that promised me lots of peace and quiet and inspiration for my writing. I was writing a book and needed to meet my deadline. I knew the quiet cabin would allow me to explore my creative process and finish writing my book. At the cabin, I would have the time and the creative space I needed. However, I didn't know the cabin was masking a dark secret that would soon consume my every thought, my sanity, and my faith of reality. When I arrived, the cabin itself was a rustic beauty, its wooden exterior weathered by time and nature's elements. The land around it stretched out into a dense forest. The trees were standing tall and imposing, their branches swaying in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It looked like heaven. The lake was crystal clear, and it was just beyond the cabin. Its surface was reflecting the surrounding forest like a mirror. It even had its own mini pier, and I could fish there if I could find some time in between writing my book. During the day, it was a peaceful oasis at the cabin, but as night fell, it took on an eerie, beautiful, yet mysterious atmosphere. The moon casting over its still waters, and you couldn't see the forest, just pitch blackness all around. As I sat by the window taking a mental break from writing, I was watching and completely mesmerized by ripples on the lake's surface. Then I noticed something kind of strange. My reflection in the glass of the window seemed to slightly hesitate. The only way I can explain this is, it was as if my reflection was unsure whether to mimic my own movements or not. I shook my head, attributing it to fatigue of writing for hours without a break or a maybe trick of the light. But the feeling of unease really lingered on the rest of that day and would not quit. Later that night, while I was laying in the bed, I heard a faint tapping at the window of my cabin bedroom. I got up to investigate it, and at the same time my heart was pounding in my chest. I was already questioning myself. What was that tapping sound? Or who is that tapping at this time of night? As I got closer to the window, I kind of stood off to the side and angled myself. Then I looked out. I saw my own reflection staring back at me in the glass of the window. It was faint, but there. Its eyes was filled with a sinister gleam. I stumbled back in shock, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What the hell was I looking at? Is that me? And as quickly as I saw it, it was gone. I freaked out and closed the cabin window curtains. I was so terrified I decided not to look again. I went straight back to bed and considered myself overly tired and convinced myself I really needed way more rest because I was absolutely mentally losing it. I decided to stay in the cabin for some odd reason. I might have been in denial already. I don't know. But everything changed after that night. Weird things kept happening. The reflections in this cabin started defying reality. The reflections in the cabin windows seemed to have a mind of its own. It would linger a moment too long, as if reluctant to mimic my movements. And sometimes it would move on its own accord, a subtle shift that sent shivers down my spine. It would start with small things, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a subtle distortion of my reflection's features. But as time went on, the mirror's hostility became impossible for me to ignore. At night, the mirror seemed to come alive, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist of their own accord. I would wake to find my reflection staring back at me with an unsteady, malevolent grin. Its eyes? The eyes were looking into my soul. They were full of empty, emotionless void, and yet menacingly terrifying at the same time. It was as if the mirror was mocking me, taunting me. I should have covered the mirrors in the weird reflections or done something like leave. But I was also compelled to look at it for some reason. So I tried to avoid the mirrors and other reflections in the cabin, to shield myself from its sinister influence. But it was no use. It was as if the mirror had a strong hold over me. It was drawing me in closer with each passing day. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, like the mirror was playing tricks on me, warping my perception of reality. The feeling of my unease grew into a deep-rooted fear. a sense of dread that followed me wherever I went. I started seeing things that weren't even there, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers in the darkness that seemed to come from nowhere. I knew then that I was no longer in control, that the mirror had taken hold of me in a way I could not understand, nor could I escape. Despite my growing fears, I couldn't tear myself away from the mirror. It held a twisted fascination for me, drawing me in with its venomous mystery. I also felt like I was being pulled into a nightmare from which I could not awaken from. I knew I needed to do something before I completely lost myself. I picked up an axe, while completely filled with anxiety, fear, and the small amount of mental strength that I could muster up. I desperately ran around the cabin and I smashed all the windows and the mirrors that I had seen evil reflections in, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. As the glass fell to the floor, the room was filled with a deafening silence. I ran to the window and the mirror in my cabin bedroom and smashed them last, dropped the axe to the floor, and screamed the biggest scream of my life. After that, for a moment, I had felt a sense of relief wash over me, believing I had finally freed myself from the mirror or reflection's curse. But as I decided to pick up and looked into the shattered remains of the mirror, I saw my reflection grinning back at me, its eyes filled with malice. The mirror was broken. I felt its hold on me was not gone, just different at that moment in time. That's when I realized then that I was not free from the mirror's curse, but rather, I think I angered whatever was in the mirror or those reflections. Desperate for answers, I decided to go to a local psychic in town. I wasn't usually into that kind of stuff, but I had some clarity at that time and decided to check out anyone who could possibly help me. The psychic in town I met with claimed to have experience with such supernatural occurrences. She listened to me intently as I recounted my weird experiences with the mirrors and reflections around the cabin. Her face was growing more somber with each detail that I told her. After a moment of contemplation, she suggested a risky course of action, a seance to communicate with the spirits trapped within the mirror or reflections in the cabin. Despite my apprehension at first, I agreed, hoping that it would finally bring an end to my torment. That night, we gathered around the shattered remains of the mirror, the room bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. The psychic began the seance. Her voice was low and solemn as she called out to the spirits. At first, there was only silence, the air thick with anticipation. But then a cold breeze swept through the room, causing the candles to flicker and dance. Shadows seemed to materialize in the corners, taking on sinister shapes and forms. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke of ancient curses and vengeful spirits, of a world beyond our own where darkness reigned supreme. As the seance reached its climax, the room was filled with a blinding light, and I felt myself being pulled towards the shattered mirror pieces in the middle of the floor. I tried to resist, to pull away, but it was no use. I found myself face to face with my reflection, but it was no longer a mere reflection. It was a twisted and evil, intentioned version of myself. It spoke to me, not with words, but with thoughts that invaded my mind, filling my head with visions of horror and despair. Everything went black, and when I awoke, I realized then that I was trapped in the damn mirror, and I was looking from the other side. It was scary, dreadful, in a dark place. I was doomed to wander this shadowy realm for eternity, a prisoner of the mirror's curse. And as I looked back at the shattered fragments of the mirror, from where I stood at that moment, I saw my reflection grinning back at me, its eyes filled with malice and smiling a sideward half-grin. I finally fully realized what happened to me. It was now in my world, and I'm in its. The mirror had won, and I was lost to its dark embrace forever. So this is my story. Luckily, I wrote this in my book. It was as if I already knew what was going to happen already. And in case anyone finds this story, beware of the mirror and reflections in this cabin.